Jai Shri Ram, everybody. I wanted to talk about Hindi versus Sanskrit because people who are on our ideological wavelength more or less often agree that there needs to be some kind of unifying language across our people. And so the debate, when that is agreed upon, of course, turns to should this language be Hindi or should it be Sanskrit? Now, I have pretty strong views for the pro Hindi side, even though I'm still in the process of learning Hindi, and I'm obviously not a native Hindi speaker. I'm a native speaker of Kannada. And the reason that I am so pro Hindi as opposed to Sanskrit is because Hindi is already spoken by a very, very large proportion of people, right? According to census data, something like 45% of people speak various dialects of Hindi as their mother tongue. And according to their census data, around 57% speak it either as a mother tongue or a second or third language. And from just talking to people from all over India, of course, mostly online, I think that the number is far higher than 57%. I think that outside of South India, the vast majority of people are at least somewhat conversational in Hindi where they can, hold a decent conversation with people and understand what people are saying, right? And that is, I think, the biggest strong point of Hindi, that it's already so popular and already so widely spoken by people. Now, Sanskrit is spoken by an extremely small number of people, people who are specifically interested in keeping Sanskrit and reviving it and all of those kinds of things. People who have this deep interest and it motivates them to study and learn. And there's these organizations like Sanskrit Bharati and other organizations that teach Sanskrit so that people can actually speak fluent spoken Sanskrit, and that's very interesting. But I don't see how such a thing could ever catch on because, I mean, right now, as I said, the majority of people in India are at least somewhat capable of speaking in Hindi, and virtually no one, I mean, far less than 1% of people can speak Sanskrit. And it was tried, early in the history of independent India to try to make Hindi an official language from the center. Interestingly enough, Pakistan did the same thing with Urdu and were actually very successful because in Pakistan they didn't have this kind of anything like the Dravidian kind of influence there. And so the various ethnic groups in Pakistan basically took to Urdu being standardized as the national language, even though a very small proportion of people spoke it there as the mother tongue, because people mostly spoke Punjabi. Punjabi speakers were like more than half the population. And then there's also Sindhi speakers, Baloch speakers, Pashtun speakers, and speakers of other small regional languages, right? So less than 10% of people spoke Urdu natively, yet they were able to take it up. Now, in India, when this was tried in the 1950s, the southern states, especially Tamil Nadu, of course, fought this. There's all these anti-Hindi agitations that happened even before independence when this kind of plan was put forward. So it unfortunately never happened at the level of the state. Then you have the three-language formula in southern states, so on and so forth, right? I think we're all more or less aware of what the situation is. But what's interesting to me is you will find people in many parts of India that have some kind of political feeling against what they call Hindi imposition, who actually can speak Hindi, right? You can find lots of Maharashtrians, maybe, a very, very large proportion of Maharashtrians that resent what they think is Hindi imposition, and they're very proud of Marathi, so on and so forth, but they're perfectly capable of communicating with people in Hindi, right? They just feel that their mother language is somehow going to be hurt by standardized Hindi being put across the entire society, right? You see this same kind of sentiment in many other places as well. And then you see this kind of knee-jerk reaction of people who live in cosmopolitan centers in different places that say, well, if people come to our state, they should learn our language. For example, I have relatives who live in Bengaluru, so I kind of pay attention to what goes on there and, you know, things of that nature. And something that I've heard from people a lot is this idea that, oh, Tamilians and Telugus and Gujaratis and North Indians come here and they don't learn Kannada and they call it Kannad and they expect us to speak in Hindi or English or whatever. And there's this kind of knee jerk reaction that, oh, if you come to our state, then you should speak our language. But, I mean, languages are not really an easy thing to pick up, right? I mean, obviously people have been able to pick up languages, right? Because of living in a certain place, but it does take some time and effort and some amount of study to be able to speak a language, which the majority of people don't really want to do if they don't have to. And also, if you have a country where, you know, people from Punjab don't feel comfortable in Kerala because they only speak Malayalam, or people in, you know, Tamil Nadu don't feel comfortable in some other state because they can't speak the language of these people, you don't really have a country, do you? You have a bunch of different states that are controlled by one central government. But if the people don't feel like the entire country belongs to them, regardless of what region that they're from, you haven't really successfully inculcated within people a cohesive national identity. So those are the reasons that I'm pro Hindi, basically. And like I said, Sanskrit is spoken by a very, very small proportion of people right now, unlike Hindi, so I don't think that it's practical. Another reason I don't think Sanskrit is practical is that it doesn't have a kind of widespread pop culture kind of encouraging people to speak it, which already exists, obviously, for Hindi. People all over India, no matter what their mother tongue is, like to watch Bollywood movies. I think we're all aware of that. And through that, they're able to pick up a significant amount of Hindi, right? People all over India, despite the fact that they also watch regional language media, people like Arnab Goswami and, various people both on the political right and the political left who speak in Hindi on Hindi language TV shows are known all across the country. So, again, people like to learn Hindi because of things like that, right? For me personally, my desire to learn Hindi comes more or less from that. There's so much discourse going on in Hindutva circles, whether it's people talking online, whether it's, people giving speeches and so on and so forth that happens in Hindi that I am just starting to understand. And so that there's not a significant amount of material out there that's in spoken Sanskrit that people feel like, in order to imbibe this, I'm going to learn this language. The only place that really exists is the scriptures. People who read, vernacular language or English translations of scriptures want to read it in the original Sanskrit. And so, many of those people start to learn Sanskrit because of that. My message to people that think that this is a reasonable argument is that you're never going to have a society where a large proportion of people, and definitely not the majority, are going to be interested in studying scripture. The average person cares about just materialism, hedonism, the narrow, selfish goals that they have for themselves and their family members, right? They're not going to pursue all of this kind of higher level thinking and philosophy and all of these kinds of things. That's always going to be a very small niche of people that's interested in that stuff, and it's just not practical to expect people at large to be interested in that. Now, a lot of the people who are pro Sanskrit, the vast majority of the people who are pro Sanskrit in the Sanskrit versus Hindi dialogue tend to put this on the state, that they want to convince people who are in, education ministry or whatever the case may be, that this is a worthwhile project so that they can change curriculums and get kids to learn Sanskrit in school so that you basically don't have to rely on people at large being interested in speaking it. And I think That's never going to happen. You're never going to convince those people because they basically want to push English. Even the people that are trying to push Hindi are facing so much opposition from people that think that we should just be pushing English because English is the language of the future and the language of international business and all these kinds of things. So even the people who are pro Hindi trying to push a language that's already very widely spoken by people across the country are facing all kinds of difficulties by the people who are pushing English and also people who are pushing their own regional vernacular languages. Now, there's also this idea from the Sanskrit crowd that, well, because Hindi is a political issue, there's going to be more opposition to it, but that's not going to be there from Sanskrit. There's going to be a hell of a lot of opposition to Sanskrit from the Muslims and from the Dalit politics, which pushes the Aryan-Dravidian divide and pushes, Brahmins are the root cause of all of the problems and social ills of India, and they're the ones that are trying to push this culture upon us, so on and so forth, right? They have this kind of narrative. You would absolutely 100% start to see this coming out in the media, in the social media, in the messaging. If these people ever thought that there was any actual chance that Sanskrit may be imposed as a national language, those people all know that this is never going to happen in, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, or whatever. And so they don't care to talk about that. They're very aware and keen to criticize Hindi imposition because this is something that has been tried at multiple times in the past, and many people are pushing for it even to this day. So the opposition, what we perceive to be the opposition from people who disagree with us, that's basically just relative to what they perceive to be legitimate so-called threats from their perspective. It's not really to do with, based on the fact that someone is criticizing something right now, we can realistically assume that, they're totally on board with things that they're not vocally criticizing at this moment. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe.